Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's lecture. I'm delighted to welcome this evening our speaker, Hugh Thompson, who is going to present his lecture, Unfit to Fly. Hugh, over to you.
Right, good evening all. It is indeed a great honour to be able to present this presentation about my flying career to you, based on my book Unfit to Fly, which was first published in 2010, 24 small logbooks, 13,000 hours, over 22,000 landings and personal reflections. The photograph shows me at a computer during a return to work course whilst unemployed, where I was able to use someone else's paper, printer and electricity to write the book. I forgot to mention in the book my one and only hot air balloon flight, where we ended up landing almost exactly where we took off from as the wind changed direction, and a flight around Europe, which I did for the Tubular Bells songwriter Mike Oldfield. It's nice to have an autobiography written by a purely civilian pilot, as most feature ex-military pilots. Can I first of all thank the Royal Aeronautical Society and our host Jenny for inviting me to present this lecture and for the help she has given me in preparing it. She asked me if I was interested in doing this lecture when learning at another event I attended that I had written a book. Unlike Lily Ayres' recent presentation about someone just starting a career in aviation, where raising the necessary finance for training is a serious and difficult consideration, mine is about someone just coming to the end of his 55-year enjoyment of flying, which is a passion to me. I followed the self-improver route to becoming a commercial pilot with financial help from my parents, 2 small grants from my local council at the second or third attempt, as anything to do with aviation was not a qualifying profession at the time. I also took out a bank loan for my instrument rating training, which was the most expensive commitment. I cannot be expected to tell you all my stories in the time available, so I've selected only a few from each stage of my flying history. I'm hoping that there will be some flight safety hints from time to time for the benefit of all pilots, as we can always learn from the mistakes and experiences of other aviators. I'm just an ordinary fixed-wing pilot who's had a lucky and varied career, having been made redundant at least 7 times, hence the variety and interest. I only left one company of my own choosing, but should have stayed just a little longer to get some redundancy money, as they ceased to trade shortly after I had left. In my 72nd year, I am still flying privately in small light aircraft, but it is getting more expensive, so I may decide to call it a day soon, especially if my main medical problem gets any worse. I have no claim to fame, except for having custody of Her late Majesty's Red Royal Box on my one and only flight as captain from Edinburgh to Aberdeen. There it is. I was born and brought up on a farm in southern Shropshire, which is clearly shown in an Ordnance Survey photo taken in 1967. I'd like you to note the road feature to the left-hand side of the print for consideration later. My home was a typical farmhouse with a nice view from my bedroom window across the farm towards the Clee Hills, where years later I created an airstrip. The farm was located under the flight departure routes from RAF Gaydon and the United States Air Force Base at Upper Heyford, so lots of Varsity, Voodoo and later F-111 aircraft flew over almost daily. So why the book title Unfit to Fly? I was born 8 weeks early and was profoundly deaf as a result. This was not obvious at the time, as I was a slow learner. It became noticeable at my first boarding school when I became frightened at not being able to hear the teacher. What actually happened was I left the classroom and was frightened to knock on the door and to hear the teacher say, "Come in," and I hid behind the cloakroom door and was missing for several hours before they found me. The fact that I had eyesight problems as well and wore spectacles overshadowed my more important hearing loss. At my first aviation medical in 1968, I was told to forget it. You're 70% deaf. In 1973, I was refused a commercial class 1 medical and told to come back in 5 years, which is what I did. I was then granted a commercial medical based on experience. But in 2004, the Civil Aviation Authority tried to ground me. But I went to see them armed with the evidence of an RAF wing commander flying in the V bomber force with one eye, a German pilot flying with one leg, etc. A compromise was agreed. I could continue flying unpressurized turboprop aircraft, but if I was to try for a job with BA, Ryanair, or EasyJet, they would ground me. The next picture summarizes some of my medical conditions and considerations. Some of you might try to read it. There we are, that's better. Medical attitudes have fortunately changed for other trainee pilots over the years, and I'm now told that I could fly completely deaf from airstrips where no air traffic control was required in daylight only. So, like all children looking for an interesting life, I became interested in flying after seeing the 1961 film X-15. There's a typical advert for it. At my second boarding school, I started regular correspondence with the commanding officer of RAF Gaydon after having been to the 1963 Battle of Britain Air Show. This resulted a year later in my parents and I being invited to the next air show, but we could not accept as I was back at school, at boarding school. Okay, there's the X-15 painting, which sort of inspired my interest. And the next slide, I think, shows the invitation that my parents had to go to the Battle of Britain at Home Day, which we couldn't go to because I was at boarding school. Anyway, no problem, we were told. Come a week earlier for a special day during which I flew in a Valiant bomber flight simulator, drove down the main runway, which I landed on 9 years later, and had lunch at the commanding officer's table. 13 years later, while in Germany with the army, I was able to personally thank him again, now an Air Vice Marshal, explaining that I was now flying as a pilot with the army. He was most grateful that I was able to meet him again, having persuaded a security official to let me approach him. At my third boarding school, Lupton School, from 1965 to 1969, I was close to Shropshire Airfield, where as a young teenager, I used to make a nuisance of myself getting regular flights and asking stupid questions. This led to a change of the school's insurance policy after the headmaster asked my father if he was happy for this interest to continue. I learnt about that conversation years later. It was while at this school that I had my serious aviation book, Flight Briefing for Pilots, Volume 1. I really thought I knew how to fly, but never realized at the time that you had to centralize the control column or stick after applying bank to remain in the turn. I still have this book to this day, with little notes in it here and there. Should be a picture now of my Oster, the Oster I learned to fly and in which I did my first solo. I started learning to fly in 1968 while still at school with an RAF instructor who nearly took my head off at Shopton during a very low flyby in a fallen gnat a year or so later. I felt the heat and smell of the jet fumes. I was tailwheel trained to start with glide approaches a requirement before first solo. A bad airmanship event was witnessed when a pilot during pleasure flights cut in front of me while I was trying to taxi, zigzagging about. A fierce argument resulted, which had me a little worried for a while. So there's the cockpit, which is very basic controls, no radio, and excellent aeroplane to start on. I still remember the starting and swinging propeller sequence to this day. Brakes on, switches off, petrol on, throttle closed, that sort of thing. During circuit work, I had an airborne scare solo when I met another aircraft head-on the downward leg of the circuit. Due to the sun, I was actually landing downwind with a very light tailwind. But the other pilot, in accordance with normal aviation practice, was doing a circuit in the opposite direction to land into the wind, even if into the sun. For the cross-country flying, I converted to a nose-wheel Cessna 150, but initially was never told how to stop the engine with a mixer control. I also had my first carburetor heat scare when I had an ever-decreasing RPM until at full throttle, I saw a knob called carb heat. After pulling it out and a very rough engine for a moment, it recovered. The Oster never suffered from carburetor icing, so I knew nothing about it. My first passenger after learning to fly and getting my PPL was my dad, but I remember calling out, "Too high, more flap" on the approach. I was warned by my mother never to fly around the farm, as during the war she had witnessed a fatal air crash at her home when a relative flew a beat-up in a Mitchell bomber and hit the main chimney with the propeller, killing his crew in the resulting crash. At about this time, I also did a gliding course off the winch at the nearby Long Mynd at Church Stretton, but I never soloed as I could not appreciate how well a glider could glide compared to an aircraft and was already tending to be too close and high. For hour building, I did a lot of hours on Golf Alpha Whiskey, the photograph showing me at Gloucester Staverton. This aircraft was later flown to Australia by Jeanette Skonberg in 1980 to commemorate Amy Johnston's 1930 trip, and then ended up in the Science Museum for many years as an exhibit. I also became a glider tug pilot, a glider pilot myself, when I achieved a 15,000-foot wave climb on my third solo flight, but later broke the canopy after doing a field out landing. I also dropped parachutists, during which I almost stalled the aircraft in a low final turn to land when I had a full load of 5 or 6 parachutists on board who, due to the wind, did not jump. The aircraft was obviously a lot heavier. I did do one parachute jump myself in answer to a bet with a lady friend. While building up hours, I did consider a job in the RAF and went for the 3-day assessment course at RAF Stafford. However, I was talked out of joining up when they realised that my passion was to fly rather than be confined to a ground role. This turned out to be a mistake, because years later, I had no other experience or qualifications other than a pilot's license when looking for work, and this went against me when being considered for jobs overseas. Ferrying the odd aircraft and doing air tests, I once discovered the trim connected the wrong way round. And coming back from London after my medical, one winter's afternoon, I flew into darkness and landed back at Shropshire with no runway lights, just a small torch. I actually made an exceptionally good landing, as I was feeling for the ground in the dark and saw the airspeed indicator was already at 0. I was already down. I was both told off and congratulated by the club CFI for showing some wartime spirit. Some years later, trying to fly home to my own airstrip under bad weather at a nearby crossroads, I followed the wrong road up a dead-end valley and had to do a 180-degree full power applied turn to avoid disaster. Okay, my 21st birthday, flying at home. My airstrip at home on the farm started with a fly-in at home close to my 21st birthday when 18 aircraft visited. A very successful day with excellent weather and light winds, clearly shown by the photographs. We were very lucky that day. There should be some photos coming up. You can see the variety of the day. However, taking all of my auntie's children for a flight together, which you'll see in the next slide, was probably a mistake. putting all your eggs in one basket. It was only after the event years later, when we were talking about it, we realized the risk had been taken, but they obviously enjoyed the flight. Once I had achieved my 150 hours, I then did a flying instructor's course at Cranfield with the famous Ron Campbell. He used to enjoy barrel rolling a Cessna 172 with a glass of water to illustrate positive G and balance. I enjoyed the atmosphere of an almost military-style airfield and felt important staying in Mitchell Hall, which was the main residence on camp. Over the next 10 years, I flew as an instructor at Shopton, Cardiff twice, Halfpenny Green and Gloucester. I also did more instructing after my commercial flying had ended as a Light Aircraft Association coaching pilot, but that ended after I had a takeoff ground looping accident in a Jodel. I achieved over 4,000 hours as an instructor and sent at least 22 students solo on their first flights, on their first solo flights. On only one did I feel I should have done more training, but he was in the forces and was being posted overseas. There are many tales I can tell you. Landing at the wrong airfield, but speaking on the radio to the other one nearby is one. Telling the student to stop braking on wet grass, which resulted in the aircraft going through a wire fence due to skidding, is another. The student on that occasion thought I had said stop by braking. But if you look behind, you're just like a pair of skis. The wheels had locked and we just slid through the fence into the corn. For a while, I and other instructors used to simulate an engine failure after takeoff by leaning the mixture, until on one occasion the engine failed to recover and I actually landed in a field of cows who showed a lot of interest in the big bird which had just arrived. This student thought it was all part of the training until he saw how red-faced I was. I once discovered a very out-of-trim pilot who seemed to be struggling. When I told him to take his hands off the control column, the aircraft pitched either nose up or nose down. I cannot remember which. Another, who has witnessed this lecture, managed a ground loop on landing after his first solo on a tailwheel type. Always remember, no landing and tailwheel aircraft is finished until it comes to a complete stop. No good looking at your passenger after landing and saying what a wonderful landing it was, and suddenly lose control and end up with a ground loop. It happens quite often. Right, early on as instructor, we used to use the hand mic and speakers, during which I used to turn the volume down, partly because of my hearing. I almost got caught out when flying above a haze layer and the temperature inversion one day. I did not receive the warning to return due to fog forming below. The higher you fly, the more you see below, but when you descend, the visibility can fall to zero. That happened at Stansted Airport when I was flying commercially. You could see the airfield perfectly well from 6,000 feet, but at 200 or 300 feet on final, when you went into the fog, you could see absolutely nothing. On a cross-country flight into Dunkeswell in Devon, one of the highest UK airfields, I once let a student fly around the circuit about 150 feet above the ground when he failed to set the altimeter to the QFE setting, the height above the ground. On one day at Shopton, an aircraft landed and parked in a rush. The pilot got out and asked, "Where am I?" Odd, I thought. On examining the aircraft, I discovered that he had set his directional indicator 180 degrees the wrong way round and had left Gloucester heading west instead of east. He should have been flying to Oxford. What happened to his initial gross error check when setting out, and where is the sun at midday, you might ask? I once flew down the coast near Cardiff at very low level, having noted about 5 US gallons in each tank of a Cherokee. On pulling up to land, the engine started to fail as the fuel pressure dropped. Calmly asking the student who's listening to us right now to change the tank, we landed successfully. Rather stupid, really, on hindsight. After 2 years, of flying at Shobden, I decided to leave non-radio Shobden, Signal Square, Shobden, for Cardiff, where there was full air traffic control and controlled airspace to get more experience. Whilst there, I had a student forced land in Porthkerry Park, probably due to carburetor icing. But I got him airborne again very quickly in another aircraft, so he did not lose his nerve. The club aircraft all had Hobbs meters fitted, which record record engine running time off the oil pressure. This caused numerous rows due to having to cross the runway to refuel or taxi to the hangar some distance away. So I stopped using them and trusted pilots to record sensible times, knowing that I could check with air traffic control the actual time of takeoff and landing. I once caught out a private pilot for flying 1 hour 20 minutes when he had only put down 40 minutes on the flight log. I had thought the fuel gauges looked a little low when I returned after my day off. Right, Harvard. When I was at Cardiff, I was able to fly a club member's Harvard from the front seat, but never solo due to insurance. But I did once fly another member's Piston Provost on one solo circuit in the right-hand seat. The brakes for landing and taxiing on that aircraft were applied by a lever on the joystick itself. When not flying due to bad weather or wind, I used to get air tests and ferry flights on various Viscount and BAC 111 aircraft from the maintenance engineering section, which is next to the flying club. On one occasion, a student and I flew to Birmingham in 18 minutes, witnessing a Viscount coming the other way 1,000 feet below, all part of quadrantal flight rules, which you used to have in those days. But it took 6 hours to come back on the train. That experience would not be possible today after 9/11 due to security considerations. I once helped a student do his exams by looking over his shoulder and suggesting the right answer from time to time. This guy, who was by nature a natural flyer, emigrated to Canada and purchased his own aircraft, flying all around the North American continent, doing over 500 hours in a year. My gut feeling about this person was correct, I'm glad to say. Years later, I did an air experience flight in a Eurostar microlight aircraft from Cranfield with an ex-small jet airline pilot who pretended he knew nothing about flying. I gave him a thorough briefing and explained everything during the flight. He complimented me on landing and revealed all. Never tell a lie. After 4 hours in the circuit at Cardiff one day, the first time I was there, I quit to pursue a new endeavour which came about by chance. It was probably a mistake to return to Cardiff in 1978, but my friends there were desperate for me to return. I might have become a commercial pilot a year or so earlier, had I not gone back there. In a holiday break from instructing, I once flew an American adventure from Houston, Texas to the Grand Canyon and back. You see the route of the flight on the slide ahead, as you can see now. I learned a lot about flying during that trip, especially density altitude. Aircraft performance, as some of you will know, is based on the international standard atmosphere, where the air temperature is assumed to fall at 2 degrees per 1,000 feet from plus 15 degrees Celsius at sea level. Instead of being 2 degrees, plus 2 degrees at Grand Canyon Airport at 6,500 feet above sea level, at a temperature of 24 degrees Celsius, the density altitude, that's the altitude the aircraft thinks it is at around 9,000 feet. Hence the requirement for long runways. In the UK, we often say mixture rich for takeoff. Not so. At an altitude of 6,500 feet, you have to lean the mixture to achieve maximum power before you actually take off. Also, setting the altimeter to read 0 on landing, the QFE, is not an option. Use of QNH, altitude above sea level, is now standard practice around the world commercially, although I do still believe the RAF use QFE for their precision approach radar approaches. In America, you can fly on the airways, VFR at odd or even plus 500 feet levels, often from VOR to VOR. That's a radio navigation beacon, which are painted white and can easily be seen. And there are no landing fees at most airfields, with a free courtesy car waiting for you to use. I only hope it was like that in the UK. So you have to pay a lot of money these days to land at any airfield you go to. Right, selection of pictures ahead that you can see there, showing the Winslow crater, the Cessna 172 I flew with a friend and myself just about to step backwards and disappear for good in the Grand Canyon. Right, I did also make a second trip to America, but was left stranded in Chicago O'Hare Airport when my friends decided to fly an aircraft back across the Atlantic themselves, but that's another story. I had to borrow nearly $3 from the US government to get home, for which I was given a severe ticking off by an American social worker. To conclude my instructional life, I was once commended for taking over air traffic control for a few minutes at Cardiff when power was lost, and it got a mention in the local press. So there's the article that you might like to read through. I became rather important for about 10 minutes or so. I was also presented with a painting when I left Cardiff the first time. The picture of the Oster I used to fly there was commissioned by Lynn Williams, a brother of the late Neil Williams, the aerobatic championship pilot. Porthcurry Park, where that student landed after an engine failure, is shown in the background. Showing some initiative, after seeing a TV programme on parachute dropping, I travelled to Netheravon seeking to get some twin engine flying. This was not forthcoming, but I was offered a non-paid holiday job in Cyprus flying a DHC-2 Beaver, which I accepted. Ironically, I was after all offered some twin engine flying in Germany, but declined to change my mind and went there the following year. There's the Beaver, civilian registered. It was rescued from Beirut at the beginning of the civil war there. And there's the engine. That's after I changed the engine, actually, from another aircraft. Okay, there's the cockpit. Believe it or not, we had to swing the propeller, which was not a problem when cold. I also decided to change the engine on my own, which I've already said, with the help of another army maintenance, with the help of an army maintenance manual, a crane, a torque wrench, and a helping hand. I left the propeller attached to both the old and new engines off another which were taken off another dilapidated Beaver. Almost at the beginning, I hit a motor car when landing as it crossed the end of the runway at Kingsfield, and I was prosecuted for flying so as to be the cause of danger to persons and/or property. I pleaded guilty. As I was at the time, obviously doing that. The army paid the fine, and a well-rhymed poem appeared in the officer's mess, Wings of Death. This is shown in full somewhere. There we are. So let's just give you a moment to read through it because it rhymes very well. Another couple of things that happened in Cyprus as an add-on to my presentation. I witnessed a hijacking at Larnaca Airport. I was actually there with the Beaver, and I got caught on the airfield and just had to sit listening to the radio communications. The hijacked DC-9 was about 300 or 400 meters away, and they were threatening to blow it up. Luckily, everything ended up, and they gave themselves up. I went on a DC-9 training flight with Cyprus Airways, took off from Larnaca Airport, 10 o'clock in the morning, flew to Akrotiri, and then across to Crete, I think it was, and then back again. Landed back after 4 hours. That was on the jump seat. Again, something you probably wouldn't be able to do today. The aircraft that I flew, being owned by a civilian operator, I took it down to Larnaca on one occasion, and the owner, with a couple of Red Cross vehicles, turned up wanting to take emergency supplies, humanitarian aid, and that sort of thing to Beirut. Well, I pointed out I was unable to do so because I was restricted to flying only in Cyprus due to my army contract. So the owner went by boat with the supplies, but he did give me a suitcase and said, could I look after it for several days? I asked what was in it. 5,000 US dollars. I said, you're joking. No, I'm not. He opened the case and showed me it, 5,000 US dollars in cash. I kept it in the officer's mess in my room under the bed and said absolutely nothing for several days. If I'd have done a runner with it, I might have been a marked man. Okay, let's carry on. During my briefing, just to finish off on Cyprus, during my briefing on arriving in Cyprus, I had a helicopter flight around the military base where we had a scary incident on the tense border. I managed about 150 hours and nearly 600 takeoffs and landings, which were the most enjoyable, with all board and lodging paid for as a guest in the officers' mess at Tequila. Right, following my time in Cyprus, I then flew the Britten-Norman Islander in Germany for the Rhine Army Parachute Association, which is based at Bad Lippspringe. The slide shows the Islander that I used to fly. However, this particular job was cut short by the Ministry of Defence when, due to defence cuts in the RAF, the RAF took over the job. Apparently, military aircrew can fly civilian aircraft without a license during the course of their duties. I managed to get 280 hours flying, which included 2 return trips to the UK, which included a downhill landing into a 25-knot headwind at my home airstrip. The flying training was done in Manchester for just over £150. But when I came home for the first time, there was a summons to court for non-payment of £76.76. I had paid half cheque, half cash. Obviously, the cash element had been misused. I sent the cheque to the court and the case was dropped. During my time flying the Islander, we had an accident when the reserve parachute was deployed inside the aircraft, pulling the student through the exit door, damaging the tailplane. On landing, the next load started to get in until they noticed a damaged aircraft. I too suffered delayed shock when, several hours after it had happened, I suddenly had a panic-type attack and was sent to the hospital for treatment. It was here that I had my second carburetor heat shock, when, due to the variable pitch constant speed propellers, the aircraft sounded as if it was flying okay, when in reality the airspeed was falling as the propellers reduced their angle of attack as the manifold pressure and power was lost. I finally realised what was happening and applied carburetor heat, getting a very rough engine response before they both regained power. Hiring a German Cessna 172 for a trip home, I flew 21 hours, 35 minutes precisely. It all being recorded on an airborne recorder, which worked when the airspeed exceeded 60 knots. In my view, this is a much safer system than the Hobbs meter, which I was telling you about, which works off oil pressure, as you are not tempted to rush your checks or taxi fast to beat the meter. When the owner collected the aircraft, he could not start it. I was called to go and see him. When I asked him if he had turned the fuel on, "Oh no," was his response. "We never turn the fuel off in Germany." Well, I did. Never assume, always check, I say. After the parachute flying ended, I sorted out my medical problem, and having now got the Class 1 commercial medical based on my previous flying experience, I did a 1-hour correspondence course with aviation whilst technically unemployed. You'll see with the next slide that I rewrote the entire syllabus longhand, which is a good way to learn a subject. And obviously took quite a lot of time, and I've still got those notes today. I then did an 8-week brush-up course at Oxford, where before passing all of my exams first time. It's always helpful to get the training notes from more than one school, as the explanation of a subject differently can help wonders. The expensive instrument rating then followed, again at Oxford, where I learnt about altimeter settings when doing an ILS approach into Stansted. I failed to set the QFE. On the go-around, or overshoot as it was called then, I flew as low as 130 feet above ground, which was a shock when the instructor opened the screen in front of me. I had a partial pass on the first test, failed the second, which got me worried that the third failure would result in having to do it all again. The advice was to go home, forget about it, and relax. On the next attempt, in really bad weather, with a cloud base right on minimums, I passed the NDB DME approach easily and got my first commercial license. The ground simulators used for some of the procedural work were good. This also helped when unemployed years later, as I recommended to get a good quality flight simulator for my computer to keep up my instrument scanning skills. Excuse me. Right, picture of a Dart Herald there. My first commercial job at Bournemouth with Express Air Services, later Channel Express, I must admit I did not like. All we ever did was two main routes to Jersey and Guernsey and the mail run to Bristol and Liverpool. However, it was a good apprenticeship for a new first officer. However, years later, the aircraft was seen all over Europe and the company expanded, so I might have enjoyed it more later on. During training, I caught a fuel spillage by selecting defuel rather than refuel. Flying at night, we had to tune to max manually on the ADF, on the automatic direction finder receiver, and one night picked up a GO ident, trying to tune to the Ignite and NDB beacon. There was no such transmission in the UK, but on checking European manuals, found that there was a GO at Gothenburg in Sweden with a 25 nautical mile range. A very good example of skywave interference at night. Next slide shows the cockpit or my office. A bit blurred, but you can see what it looked like. I had my roughest flight during one flight to Liverpool, when due to severe turbulence, you could only select a switch or lever by moving your arm with the other. This was a case of aviate first if ever there was one. Forget the paperwork, I was told by the captain, and concentrate on flying the aircraft. I also flew back across the channel once with the gear down, but the captain got ticking off for doing so. Had we lost an engine fully loaded, we might have ended up in the drink, as they say, but we were trying to save the company money. Two paperwork issues I recall was constantly having to fill in a crew declaration of customs every time we flew to any of the Channel Islands, and the constant need to report an early ground proximity warning system warning every time we crossed the northern coast of Jersey. Sadly, but secretly glad, I was made redundant on a last in, first out basis. However, it was a blessing in disguise. I'd flown just 355 hours as a young first officer, but after paying for accommodation in the Bournemouth area, I've been hard pressed to pay off my bank loan for the instrument rating. The owner at Shropshire Airfield, a close friend of mine who wrote the foreword to the first edition of my book, immediately got me a job with Flight 1 Limited, who flew a small fleet of 4 Scottish Aviation twin Pioneers. There's Golf Alpha Zulu Hotel Juliet on approach, ironically, into Berlin, of all places, but it wasn't me at the controls on that occasion. Due to the scarcity and unusual characteristics, training on the aircraft was done by someone already flying it. The cockpit was 12 feet off the ground and actually rose slightly during the landing as you achieved a tail down 3-point attitude. Inside, it looked like a little bit like a Dakota cockpit, with sort of old-fashioned sort of wartime type instruments. One unusual rule that for civil use, takeoff flap could not be used for takeoff, as an engine failure, if one occurred, would be well below the takeoff safety speed to retain control. The main drawback was that due to the nature of the work we did, like aerial surveys, there was often long periods of no work at all, followed by some intense flying over a short period. I flew jobs in Ireland, Norway, where we flew to find some snow, over London itself, including Heathrow, to Germany, and with the military over various weapons ranges and training areas. I did 89 hours flying in 13 days in Ireland, and 55 hours flying in 8 days over the English Channel, 800 feet, sometimes in fog. There should be a few photos. I have to admit that I once left the cockpit for 30 seconds when in the cruise to retrieve my flight bag and maps when they had all left the cockpit on takeoff. In the cruise, the aircraft was exceptionally stable, which is why it was such a good survey platform for vertical ordnance survey photography. Some of these photographs you've been seeing were taken by the well-known aviation historian and photographer Edward Shackleton, who is listed in the Guinness Book of Records of having flown the greatest number of aircraft types. He has now sadly passed away. His flight with me was at short notice to Oxford and back for a radio check. He jumped at the chance when I rang him the evening before. The Irish job was flown to Dublin via RAF Valley for CH&I, that's Customs, Health and Immigration. But a customs officer had to be sent from Holyhead docks because of the equipment we were carrying. In Ireland, I remember well the well-known comment in every conversation, no problem. And before flying, I always checked the actual weather reports before taking off for the survey area, which is shown in the next picture. All the lines shown were flown at 600 feet using British military survey maps from the 1900s, based on a 6 miles to the 1 inch scale. You can imagine there's paperwork all over the cockpit. Had a pilot on one side and a sort of flight navigator on the other side, who I'm hoping is actually listening to the lecture while we speak. Once the temperature and the dew points on the weather report started to split, we were off, because there's no point going flying when very, very low cloud and you can't see anything. The longest flight on that survey was just over 7 hours. During the survey over the channel, we navigated using a system called Silidis, which is the forerunner to the modern GPS today. And that's a small bit of information about it, which I found in Wikipedia. Doing ordnance survey work out of Cardiff one day for targets in East Anglia and North Wales, all we achieved was an aerial photograph of my own home, which in this shot in 1981, coming up now, shows the Milton airstrip alongside the road I asked you to note earlier 1967 photograph. It was a camera check over a location, obviously chosen by myself. Right. Should have a picture now, Prestwick, there we are. Prestwick, I once flew a mystery flight from Cranfield to Prestwick on a very clear cavalcade day over the Lake District. Beautiful weather it was. Really enjoyable flight. Apparently, I took a British aerospace scientist from their Stevenage factory all the way to Scotland for lunch, after which we then returned. What I did not know was that in his small briefcase, which he had carefully secured in the passenger seat with cushions all around it, contained, I was told, 5,000 miniature detonators of some kind for some kind of missile, which I believe British Rail wouldn't allow to be sent by train. On another job for Stevenage, we flew repeatedly around several villages close to the disused airfield of Stony Cross, northeast of Bournemouth, for several weeks, much to the annoyance of the local villages. The following newspaper article appeared entitled Moaning Monster. Again, I'll give you a moment or two to read part of it. I personally flew 8 of these flights over a 2-week period, round and round for about 2 hours at a time. What no one realised was on Stony Cross Airfield was a trailer hooked to a Land Rover, and inside the trailer was radar reflectors spinning round on a wheel to simulate moving tanks. We were developing some kind of anti-tank missile. Perhaps I shouldn't have said that. Right, to conclude this section about the Twin Pioneer flying, I once flew as low as 100 feet to find a fishing boat in the North Sea. This was so we could be picked up on the ship's narrow beam radar. I also landed in whiteout conditions in Germany south of Stuttgart, and I was asked by air traffic control on the way there if we were a helicopter, as the aircraft flew so slowly at just 100 knots. Interestingly there, we were flying at a Mengen airfield in southern Germany for about 2 weeks, again doing military development work. And I was flying directly head on to a Transall, C-160 Transall, a little bit like a sort of mini Hercules. And the German pilot and I decided before we started flying that it was absolutely clear cut that I would fly over top of him and he would fly underneath me, just to make sure there was no discrepancy or misunderstanding. The other thing was that for that 2 weeks of flying, I constantly saw to the south of the airfield what appeared to be cumulonimbus clouds. And I thought, good God, the weather looks a bit rough down there. It's only after about a week or two, the penny dropped that it was in actual fact the Alps with the snow on them in the distance. Right, I decided to leave the Twin Pioneer flying due to lack of work. But I wish I had not, as afterwards, about a month or so later, they ceased trading, and I would have qualified for some redundancy money had I stayed just a little longer. During the summer holiday period, whilst I was flying the Twin Pioneer, I flew to America and helped ferry a Fighter Arrow across the Atlantic. Starting in Oregon, flew across the States, passing over Niagara Falls, up through Canada across Hudson Bay, then across the Atlantic via Greenland and Iceland. And the slide here shows the route that we flew. We did rather short legs rather than one long one. Okay, it was all done VFR, as another aircraft with us had navigational aid problems, but we never landed any place with less than half tanks. We were delayed for about a week at Nook on the west coast of Greenland due to sea fog affecting Kulusuk, our next destination across the Greenland ice cap. Flying over the ice cap, a speck appeared on the windscreen, which turned out 45 minutes later to be Sob Story, one of the early warning radar stations on the ice cap. You can see it on the picture on the top left-hand side there. And this was an example of unlimited visibility with nothing to judge distance against. It was an interesting 60 hours of flying. Normal topographical charts are not much use because the terrain is basically featureless. But radio navigational charts are. Personally, I did not think it was well planned, as we did not have much in the way of survival equipment, and the only surprise was the length of daylight in the northern latitudes. My next enjoyable commercial job was flying the Twin Otter for 5 years from 1986 to 1991. I flew for Hubbard Air twice, from Cardiff and Southend, Southeast Air flying out of Heathrow, of all places, Loganair for a short while, and Brymon Airways based at Birmingham. This one was for nearly 3 years on a 2 afternoons, 2 mornings, 2 days off basis. My first solo flight on the Twin Otter as captain, solo captain, single crew, was doing a Liverpool-Cardiff mail run. I had the stall warner go off in the descent at 160 knots. I had to endure the horn until after landing, when I eventually found a circuit breaker behind my seat. Being single crew up to 1990, we could take fare-paying passengers on the flight deck for a friend. I took my father, my mother, my girlfriend at the time, but these days you couldn't do that sort of thing. Once, on a Civil Aviation Authority flight ops inspector check, he tried to get me airborne when fog was forecast and reported. Sadly for him, he had to come back another week to fly on a different day. He was trying to persuade me to fly with a diversion for Dublin, and I wouldn't accept the idea. Early on in my flying on the aircraft, I had a yellow warning light show on the central warning panel, which is shown on the sort of top of the panel on the photograph on the right. I thought it was telling me that ice boots were selected on. But on landing one night, someone told me that the right wing, which you could not easily see from the cockpit, was covered in ice. I'd been regularly checking the left wing on my side, so thought nothing was wrong. The actual connection pipe for the hot air that blew the boots up had come adrift. And that's why I had the warning light on, but I didn't realise its significance at the time. When flying one day for Loganair at Glasgow, after 4 sectors, I was asked to change aircraft for a last flight to Inverness. Initially, I had a propeller feathering problem and returned to the stand. Later, after takeoff, I then had failure of both direction indicators, and after a messy, uncomfortable flight, ended up approaching Inverness from the north rather than from the south. I did not descend below safety altitude until within certain distant ranges on the DME, which allowed for a gradual descent. My big mistake was not to look at the standby compasses or the standby compass for basic navigational guidance. For that error, I was asked to leave Loganair or accept a demotion to a first officer for a while. Regrettably, and with hindsight, I left and went back to Hyper Air. Tiredness played a part, as it all happened at the end of a very long day. Had I stayed, I think I would have had an enjoyable career with Loganair, as I enjoyed being in Scotland, even if I found their accents difficult to hear. Flying out of Heathrow, I avoided the Great Storm in 1987 by finding a small fuel leak, which mysteriously disappeared the next day. But it was probably caused by the very low atmospheric pressure. I also did not like the very warm gale force winds and heavy rain, which caused me some concern. A British Airways engineer did confirm the next day to the company that there was an oil leak, there was a fuel leak. During my flying from Birmingham to Gatwick, Concorde used to regularly fly underneath the aircraft, and I managed to take a photo, which is shown, in which are in fact several on top of one another, showing a pile of bricks and disused house on my farm and that sort of thing, but you can see Concorde in the middle there. This Concorde caused the famous Concorde air miss, which was documented in a BBC Two Horizon documentary back in 1990, and it can still be found on YouTube today. Passengers used to look out of the port side windows and then immediately looked out of the starboard ones as Concorde passed underneath. Flying over Luton at 8,000 feet once, I was struck by lightning, which damaged the nose and tail, passing straight down the cabin aisle. What do you say to your passengers? Enjoy the remainder of your flight. As they say, like lightning never strikes twice. The aircraft was actually grounded for 2 days for extensive checks to make sure all the various bonding wires between the various components hadn't been burnt out. At Birmingham, I was on one occasion recalled to the stand by air traffic control after we had departed. A running late commercial pilot had used his initiative to recall his positioning flight to Gatwick. Both air traffic control and myself got a ticking off, as did he, from his airline. Continuing the Twin Otter tales in the UK, I wanted a flight with a mysterious Jersey European Airways call sign. Southeast Air had gone bust, but I was never told. The Civil Aviation Authority at East Midlands allowed me to continue my flights that night, but I had to pay for both the fuel and landing fees using my credit card at East Midland and Liverpool. I did eventually get the money back, however. Letters to the CAA about this and another case where I exceeded my duty hours went unanswered. Years later, I was told they are not interested in the pilot making an honest mistake, only the sharks who deliberately and intentionally deceive. Once the stewardess was running late as she had overslept. No problem, I said. You go straight to the aircraft. I took the cash float, the meal packs and the drinks bar to the aircraft in a black bin bag. When she got on in a hurry, just before takeoff, seeing the bag, she threw it out. After takeoff, she comes up to the cockpit to ask where the items were. Did someone at Birmingham have a surprise windfall, or did the rubbish actually get put into the skip? We will never know. Finally, doing a radar approach, this is into Liverpool, I once turned on to finals as I could see the runway before I'd been told to do so. A visit to air traffic control after landing got me a severe reprimand, as how could I be sure that it was not another aircraft landing in the other way in light wind conditions? I thought at the time I was being helpful to the controller, as he was very busy. A couple of other basic things that happened on the Twin Otter. 20 minutes, I flew into Gatwick on one occasion and landed with 20 minutes of fuel left. The passenger sat in the right-hand seat in the cockpit, reported me to the airline, Brahmin Airways, and I had to explain myself. Turned out that I'd done absolutely nothing wrong. I'd followed all the procedures correctly, but I was held by air traffic control, first at Mayfield VOR, and then after leaving Mayfield VOR on a radar heading, I was then told to do another radar hold, and all of this transpired to make me land with less than 20 minutes of fuel. But as I said, I've done absolutely nothing wrong. Also going into Gatwick on one occasion, as I reduced power, I realised that I couldn't restore the power. Once I pulled the throttle back, I had no power. I discovered it on the approach and managed to land safely. I got a commendation from Brahmin Airways for the way in which I diagnosed the fault on that occasion. Also had a shutdown going to London Heathrow once, coming back from Brussels, I think, when I had an indication of oil pressure loss. That was rather interesting, landing Heathrow 3 o'clock in the morning on one engine. Back at Birmingham, I also did a radar approach in very, very hazy conditions one summer afternoon onto the what is now a closed runway. It used to be the sort of crosswind runway at Birmingham. And I made an approach, saw some what I thought were runway lights, and they turned out to be the Rover car factory. So I had to do a go around. Okay. Right, other stories. That's it. There are more stories, but you'll have to read my book if you want to find them. The next photograph shows the Twin Otter Golf Bravo Golf Mike Delta. This particular aircraft followed me wherever I went. All the different operators I flew with seemed to be having this aircraft in their fleet. It was leased from an agency. This aircraft now is in the Maldives as a float plane. I did go to the Seychelles on a Boeing 707 cockpit jump seat for a job interview once, over 4 days in late 1990. And I flew to the islands there, which had airstrips. I flew to all the islands that had airstrips. So there's a couple of pictures. They also had obstructions on the runway. There we are, a turtle. Used to call up saying we were coming into land, and a little lad would go out and sort of quietly persuade the turtle to get off the runway. Despite being offered a tax-free salary, the advice I got from another pilot already there was that paradise is great for about a month, but then the novelty wears off. It's also expensive to live in a sought-after tourism island. I therefore turned it down. What a mistake that was, as a month later I was made redundant from Ryman Airways. Had I known what was coming, I would have accepted the Seychelles, and who knows where I would be now. Ryman Airways did try for a while using a short SD360 leased from Gillair and/or Celtic Airlines, but it was uneconomic, and I was made redundant at the end of 1990. The conversion course, however, was good, with a ground school at Bristol Airport in the building of a company which had gone bust. I remember the telephones were, however, still connected, which was a bonus. 7 years out of work followed, after which I've done my ATPL exams after a hard course in London, but I did still like aircraft and tried to keep my medical instrument rating current. However, the job centre was less than helpful, not realising the cost involved in remaining commercially current. I once asked them to give me a non-return airfare to Nairobi in Kenya, but they refused. Had they done so, I would have found a job instantly, as CVs in Africa just pile up in offices and are rarely read. Apparently, job centres do not take kindly to aviators, as once someone got them to fund a helicopter training course, only for them to realise it was only for a PPL, and the recipient had conned them into paying for it. I did have a ground school job at Oxford for a while, for about a year, but I didn't, where I did my instrument rating, but I did not enjoy it, as it was very, very hard work, and I used to travel daily to work. So my short SD360 flying career, this is a picture of one of the aircraft we flew, BAC Express. Started badly when I landed with the brakes on during my initial training. Most airliners have anti-skid brakes so that they will not lock on landing, but it will only work once the wheels have started turning. That's a typical short SD360 cockpit. I first flew as a first officer and eventually a captain for over 10 years from bases at Cardiff, Bristol, Exeter and Birmingham when flying in Scotland. One company, Air Contractors, based in Dublin, based all aircrew at home, which made a vast difference to our incomes. They operated on a 2 weeks on, 1 week off, with a 1 week of contactables in which you were at home but could be called to work within 24 hours notice. When they sold their operation to another operator, the difference in salary and allowances was about £500 a week doing the same job from Exeter, as I was now considered to be based at Exeter, not at home, and therefore responsible for my own local accommodation and travel to and from Exeter. The flying was mostly at night during mail and freight work. We were always flying with a low fuel margin, especially during the winter months when fog was always a risk. Some flying stories include loading the wrong cargo, leaving the seats behind when doing passenger work, thinking the seats were waiting for us on arrival at the airfield we were going to do the passenger work. flying aircraft to different locations only to realise the swap over could have been done during the turnaround at the same location later on, and not thinking ahead. I believe the company fortunes were changed when the profit sharing scheme was introduced, making everyone, including the aircrew, think more. As a first officer on a flight out of Venice one night, we were back on the ground within 20 minutes due to encountering rain ice, which is caused when you fly through supercooled water droplets, which instantly freeze on contact with the wing or an object. The ice was still covering the aircraft an hour after landing, especially the nose cone. Believe it or not, I also had a bird strike at 6,000 feet over London at 2 a.m. in the morning. The captain and I had to clean the cockpit windscreen ourselves at Stansted, as the cleaners on landing wanted nothing to do with the carcass and remains. At Edinburgh, when captain, I had a bird strike on the approach just before landing, and I said nothing until parked on the apron. This led to a telling off, as a bird carcass attracts other birds, and that increases the risk to other aircraft. I should have reported it immediately. Also, as captain, the post office once insisted that we fly to East Midlands despite a very bad weather forecast and reports. I told them we would not get in, and I was proven correct. Having tried to divert to Stansted, which was also very bad, we eventually landed at Southend, which luckily has a good weather record or weather diversion record, and we were very short of fuel. The Mail obviously ended up nowhere near its intended destination. In another flight, when I was the first officer, left myself and the captain very dehydrated and quite ill. After 9/11, security at Exeter prevented us from taking a drink with us. We even offered to have a drink out of the bottle to prove the liquids were not explosives. Due to fog at Coventry, we diverted to East Midlands, where eventually the cargo arrived, only to be refused entry as the security gate did not expect it. After an hour or so, the ramp controller ordered the gate be opened, as the parking bay was needed for a scheduled inbound aircraft in about an hour. As no handling agent had been allocated to us, the captain, the lorry driver, the ramp officer, and myself all had to load the cargo ourselves. It included the heavy coughing of a deceased lady, which ironically got the gates open when it was pointed out that not allowing her to get home for a burial would be disrespectful. The net result of all this was a very long duty period with no refreshments of any kind. And we were quite dehydrated and had severe headaches when we finally got to Dublin, of all places. Following a mandatory occurrence report to the Civil Aviation Authority, I believe that bottled water then became part of the technical requirements of a flight and was allowed to be placed on the flight deck during turnarounds, checks, and maintenance. During my time on the shed, as it was nicknamed, TORS and TCAS systems have to be fitted. That is terrain awareness warning system and terminal collision avoidance systems. This increased air safety electronically, but in my view, led to a lack of airmanship and threat awareness with the crews. If you're going to fly into a mountain, it will tell you to pull up. Ironically, it does not normally work if there's a vertical cliff face ahead of you. And if you have a risk of collision, it will tell you to climb or descend. There's therefore no need to look out of the window anymore. I'm not so sure about that. So the final aircraft I flew, this was the last commercial aircraft and the last commercial flight I flew after the company went bust. I flew it into retirement from Coventry to an airfield in Denmark. Despite trying to find new employment in aviation, I was always politely told not successful on this occasion. But in reality, at 59 years of age, I was probably considered to be too old. On one night flying into RAF Kinloss in Scotland, in response to an air traffic control request, "What type of service do you require?" the captain replied, "To land," which was not favourably received. I can add a couple of other points that I've got here. Just before I landed with the brakes on, the ground engineer showed me 2 burst tyres behind the porter cabin at Exeter, saying, "Don't ever do that." But I did, unfortunately. Also, we did a long flight over fog-bound UK from Bournemouth to Edinburgh with very, very little in the way of reserve fuel. The reason for this was that we were flying from Exeter to Bournemouth, knowing there was no fuel at Bournemouth. We uplifted about 20 minutes of extra fuel at Exeter. But when we arrived at Bournemouth, the aircraft on the stand was late leaving. We had to wait on the taxiway with the engine running for about 20 minutes before we could come onto the stand. So the extra bit of fuel we took had been burnt away and we couldn't uplift any fuel. I remember on that flight I was constantly checking the GPS for the go to Edinburgh to see how many minutes was left, and then calculating at £18 a minute of fuel, how much fuel we had left. It was a bit of a tight one, but we made it. Also, the terrain awareness warning system that I told you about. On one day going into Benbecula on the Outer Hebrides, I asked the training captain on a very nice sunny day with no wind, I said, "Could we fly at that mountain over there and see if it actually works?" And he said, no. He said, "We can't do that. We can't do that." When we landed, I said, "Well, what was the problem?" He said, "No wind. We wouldn't have no turbulence. We would turn away." He said, no. If it had gone off, I would just had a day of paperwork filling in why it had gone off. Okay, my light aircraft flying. This particular aircraft is a Europa. My light aircraft flying over the years has been very interesting and varied, but the Europa shown was an aircraft unique to itself. Rather like a glider, it only has one wheel with small outriggers on the wingtips. This meant that there was no differential braking, and often on narrow taxiways and runways, you had to get out and lift the tail round yourself. On one of these aircraft, I asked the trainee owner to start on the reserve tank, which caused the engine to stop. Trying it in the off position, it started perfectly well. The previous owner had never tried the reserve, and he had always left it on the main as the fuel came out of the same tank. Not quite correct, as it turns out, as part of the fuel was located in the sump of the tank as a reserve and could only be used via the reserve selector on the fuel cock. In this particular aircraft, it had been connected wrongly. On another Europa, I told the owner to clean the fuel filters after about 2 to 3 hours of flying. On the very next flight, as the engine faltered at 300 feet, I asked him if he had changed them, which he had not. "That was the reason I asked you to change them," I said, as minute glass fibre spores from within a new tank take a long time to be washed out of the tank. Of a brand new tank, it gets into the fuel filter. I also flew to a grass airstrip in East Anglia on one occasion, having asked for permission to do so. On the approach, I noticed some small but very tall trees, which I was not sure I would clear on the takeoff later, so I diverted to nearby Ipswich when there was an airfield there. Walking the airstrip later, I found someone had rammed a wooden stake with a number 7 on it as a gun stand for a pheasant shoot. It was my lucky decision, as I would surely have hit it on landing, doing some serious damage to the wing. I've flown solo or as P1 about 70 different types over 33 years, and currently flying either a Cessna 152 from Shobden or a PA-38 Tomahawk from Slape. So what about my legacy, Milton Airstrip, which is located on the Little Down Farm west of Birmingham? The Get Mapping photograph in the year 2000 clearly shows the airstrip. And as you can see the road, which I pointed out to you on the other photographs earlier. After my successful 21st birthday flying in 1973, the airstrip operated perfectly well for 18 years with no problems at all. But then a NIMBY neighbour, that's a not in my backyard neighbour, came to live very close by, who immediately complained repeatedly to the local district council. I tried to be helpful, but ended up with unrealistic conditions, which were later slightly improved. In fact, if I'd done nothing, I would have been given permitted development rights due to the length of time with evidence that it had been established. Oh, you should see some airfield views. One on the left shows one of the fly-ins I had, and the one on the right is the down slope from the northern end of the airstrip. 450 meters officially, 500 meters you go to the top of the hill. So it's a little bit tight, but on a perfectly nice day with light winds, it's a perfectly good airstrip to fly from. Unfortunately for aviation, local councillors do not seem to understand flying. For example, most do not know the difference between a microlight and an aircraft. I had one visit me saying flying should not be allowed at weekends for peace and tranquility in the countryside. I asked him if he ever went on holiday. Yes, he said, admitting he sometimes flew from airports in the early hours. Ban that as well then, I said. After that admission, I had no more trouble from him. Also, bear in mind a thought for all those who live under the main air routes, standard instrument departures and standard terminal arrival routes, for example, to the major airports. Little Down Farm to the west of Birmingham, open countryside, very little in the way of air traffic flying overhead. So really, I don't know what there is to complain about. Okay, good picture here showing some of the visitors I had to the airstrip over the years. The photograph on the top right shows the dilapidated, disused farm buildings and house, which I inherited when I was given the farm. Obviously, the airstrip took precedence. Helicopter use by the military, which was at my invitation from RAF Shawbury, caused no end of problems. Ironically, the lack of use caused by a helicopter visiting is more noticeable. People living next to a motorway or a railway line, for example, become accustomed to the background or endemic noise. So we should have some pictures there. A squirrel and a Griffin helicopter, which used to visit the airstrip quite regularly. Okay, the windsock pole, as you can see, came from Morton Valence in Gloucestershire. The M5 motorway was constructed down the old runway there, and the pole was next to the road. After making inquiries to find the legal owners to no avail, I eventually stole it. Turned out to be rather more than I'd bargained for as far as weight was concerned. There should be another photograph showing a few more visitors. The Miles Gemini there is the only one still flying and now based in Liverpool. And the Gypsy Moth, I think it is, that was built in 1928. It was exported to America and it came back to the UK and used to regularly fly in from an airstrip near Ledbury. So, do you take off uphill into wind or downhill downwind? I gave a convincing example in a Piper Cherokee during one of my many fly-ins. I barely clear in the trees with a stall warner sounding. Generally, a downhill takeoff downwind is best, especially if there are no immediate obstacles to climb over. Oh, Little Down. The two photographs show the disused buildings and the disused old farmhouse,
before I had ownership and then when I sold it in 2001, the difference between the two. In nearly 20 years, I transformed the farm residence from a derelict site to an ideal home with the usual airstrip in generally light wind conditions. I would say that on average, the airstrip is only flyable for about 100 days a year, either due to strong winds and or soggy wet ground. Sadly, in recent times, the very wet weather we have been having has grounded all but the helicopter visitors. On the weekend I sold the airstrip to its new owner, who is listening to this presentation, I had a grand finale fly-in, during which a total of 85 aircraft visited me to say farewell. What I call my legacy photograph, showing 50 aircraft, microlights and helicopters, was taken by someone passing overhead who did not land. Very nice photograph. 30 minutes either way, and there would have been gaps in the lineup of visitors from top to bottom. I was somewhat surprised by the turnout, so someone obviously had spread the word, and we were luckily blessed with light winds and good weather for the whole day. Some of you might notice the broken curtail on the left side of the photograph. That aircraft took its wheels off on landing, and both pilots in it had thought the other was doing the landing. Would you believe it? They wrecked their own aircraft. A few brief recollections before we finish. Being distracted or rushed during checks caused me to take off with the Peter covers on more than one occasion. I left the fuel caps undone until told, and I left the battery master switch on, ending up with a flat battery on several occasions. Many flying clubs these days insist on leaving the rotating beacon on in case you walk away, turn around and see the lights still flashing. I witnessed a startup at Shropshire Airfield with the nose wheel tow bar still on. And I waved to the pilot to shut down his engine. And he wondered why I was doing that. But I said, well, you've left your tow bar on the nose wheel. On one occasion, the owner of Shropshire Airfield, ironically, called me to the aircraft, wondering why the circuit breaker of the alternator kept tripping out every time he started the engine. I said, well, it's obvious. All the electrical switches are on when the pilot thought they were off. And I myself flew an aircraft once without being sure it was insured. I got told off for showing the enthusiasm to be the first to fly it. It was, after all, insured. At an airfield, Halfpenny Green, it was, I think, I once saw a student pilot trying to fly his aircraft, correction for that, trying to start his aircraft. All the lights were on and black smoke was coming out of the exhaust. Going to his aid, I told him to switch off all the electrics, open the throttle fully, and with a mixture at lean, start again, reversing the two levers as it fired up. He had flooded the carburetor by overpriming. I never got any thanks for it from the school. The Ruskin quote, which I used to pass almost daily when I had a job working at Oxford as a ground school instructor, it sums me up quite well, don't you think? All right, Kit Fox, the Kit Fox that I had. I owned this aircraft for about a year until my one and only total engine failure caused me to land in this particular field. It was not classed as an accident, as no additional damage was done, and it was considered an engineering occurrence. It actually happened on Friday the 13th. The reason behind it was a lack of maintenance awareness by myself. But as I did not know about this particular engineering problem, how could I do anything about it? How long is a piece of string? You read my book, Prologue, it explains what it was. To summarize and finish, My best non-aviation story that I can tell you is a runaway tractor on the farm. I got off it to move a fallen branch from a tree whilst thistle cutting on the farm. But when I turned round, it started moving downhill, gathering speed as I ran after it. Luckily for me, it wheel tire in the field beyond, just before it would have fallen into the river at the... Okay. Right, the Kit Fox that you see in the picture, I used to own this aircraft for about a year until my one and only total engine failure caused me to land in this field. It was not classed as an accident, as no additional damage was done, and it was considered an engineering occurrence. It actually happened on Friday the 13th. The reason behind it was a lack of maintenance awareness by myself, but as I did not know about it, how long is a piece of string? Read my book prologue to find the answer. Ironically, my partner, I didn't ring her or tell her about it because I was going up north somewhere, but the neighbour came round with a copy of the local paper, the Shropshire Star, and said, "Is this Hugh?" Because the Shropshire Star had put it on the front page that Milton airstrip owner has engine failure or something, and it was on the front page. So she knew about it before I rang her. So the best on non-aviation story I can tell you is a runaway tractor on the farm. I got off it to move a fallen branch from a tree whilst thistle cutting on the farm. But when I turned round, it had started moving downhill, gathering speed as I ran after it. Luckily for me, it passed through an open gate and ran over an old main wheel tire in the field beyond, just before it would have fallen into the river at the bottom of the hill. No witnesses, so it's my word only. As a summary, anyone with a passion for something like flying can almost certainly achieve anything they want with hard work and determination. Do not be put off, but I must admit, getting finance for such an enterprise can be difficult these days. The balloons in the next photograph, this was not in my ownership, but the current Milton airstrip owner. The airstrip was once covered one early morning by hot air balloons, much to the owner's dismay. There had apparently been a misunderstanding in the conversation a day or so beforehand, which led to a surprise awakening. He didn't know about this until he looked through the bedroom window at about 7 o'clock in the morning, found his airstrip completely covered with hot air balloons. Excuse me. The Tomahawk, which is shown, this was one that I was part owner of for several years at Kemble in Gloucestershire. I was lucky to sell my share just after COVID struck for what I had originally paid for it. I still miss it now, but another one a little closer to home. I still fly another one a little closer to home. Some of the current owners have been listening to the presentation, so thank you for that. My book title, Unfit to Fly, it's about to be published again with a second edition with an additional chapter, the flying I've done in the last 10 years. And it is being produced by New Generation Publishing Limited. And it should become available soon. So that's about it. Thank you very much. And I hope you've enjoyed it and given you plenty to think about.
Thank you very much, Hugh. I shall just stop the recording before we take questions from the audience.